And here we are. Fantastic. You could move it on to the first slide, actually, because I'm going to talk to that. Right. Welcome to our talk. Thank you for coming. We have a varied menu for you. My name is Clive Palmer, and I have the absolute pleasure and privilege of supervising these three. There's two here. I'm not sure where Craig has gone. I have this pleasure of here he is, here's Craig, of supervising Craig, Glenn and Danny on their PhDs. And they're all doing very different projects. And I've often wondered what starts to bring these people together in my supervision for them, because they're all doing very, very different things on the surface. So Glenn is on a new PhD program called PhD by Portfolio, which is aimed at career professionals to engage in a highly reflective sort of exercise looking back over their career. So Glenn is on a new PhD program. Craig and Danny. Craig is a member of staff at the University of Central Lancaster, where we work. And anyone who's supervising staff, you will understand some of the joys and implications of that. Danny is not a member of staff, but he did work for UCLan for a short period in China. And Danny is doing a study ostensibly on football. Craig is also doing a study largely on football. And they will both attest to you that I have pretty much zero knowledge of football. Glenn is here as a dermatology skin viability expert, of which I also have zero knowledge of. So, and there are others that fall into this sort of disparate collective that I'm supervising. So I have this image, and I had to resort to my own sort of rope store to come up with this idea of common threads. And aligning these people in somehow their interests become aligned, and it's largely through methodology and shared interest in writing about their experiences, and that's very much common to them all. So I often question, well, what is it I am expert in? Because I'm not expert in any of their things. I'm quite happy not being an expert, really. But if there's anything, I guess it's joining these people together, but not in a knotted way, in a sort of, I wouldn't say seamless either, but kind of running parallel type of idea, where they can start to look across each other's shoulders and go, do you know, it's okay that we're doing the same thing, but kind of differently. And different is good, but I'm stronger in the community for sharing my ideas and my expertise with others when we talk and you go, oh, Clive told me to do that. And I've written this, and oh yeah, you did that as well, but I did that in this context. Why don't we share? And their writing and their enthusiasm begins to infect each other for the good. So sometimes I'm just sort of dancing around the edges saying, hey, let's bring everyone together and have a nice time. But also encouraging them to write and share, and then realizing their own links so they can align their own interests. So without further ado, what we're going to do is Glenn is going to speak first, followed by Danny, followed by Craig. You'll know that he's brought his guitar and he's going to be singing his data to you. And that has been an interesting exercise as well. All three have been through a sort of different levels or different depths of reasoning and sense making about their experiences that they're going to talk to you about. And it's the but it's not. The deeper you delve into their study and realize that what it's not about is where their common ground is. And that's probably the sort of underworld where I swim around and help them. So on that basis, as a supervisor, that sort of pretty much is outlining what I try and do. So each person's going to speak for about 10 minutes, and then or sing, indeed. It won't be singing for 10 minutes, it's singing for 4 minutes, right? And our online community, there's a a link for them to listen to as well as the live performance. And we'll have questions at the end. Hopefully there will be some vibrant interest to explore. So, on that note, I'll hand over to Glenn. I'm going to sit to the side, and you've got 10 minutes. Oh, yes. You might want to either hold that or clip it to you.
Oh, that's right, I'll do that. There we go. That's it, got it. Okay. My wife would be so proud because I'm terrible with technology. I feel like I should start with like a confession, having heard the first session, because I want to say it sounds like Alcoholics Anonymous. My name's Glenn and I'm a mental health nurse, but I'm not doing that anymore, and that's part of the story. And I think what I'd like to start with is a question which is based on the theme of the conference and is related to my PhD, which is the idea of, if you're part of a murmuration, how do you steer the murmuration? If your job is actually to lead and lead across a group, how do you actually do that? And in an institution. And so I'm a mental health nurse by training, and I trained in 1998 to 2001. Unfortunately or unfortunately, I got my first job on September the 11th, 2001, and I was going to go out and celebrate, but unfortunately, given the day, I couldn't. I moved to the island in 1988. I grew up in Surrey, and a great part of my early years in Surrey was actually spent in hospital because I wasn't very well. And so there's always a thread or an argument that if you've been exposed to or enculturated into a hospital environment, does that guide your career choices when you're older? Well, you could argue that. The research doesn't say that, but then research says lots of things that perhaps it does or doesn't mean. And so when I came to the Isle of Wight in 1988, I basically was enculturating myself into a culture that I wasn't familiar with. Surrey and the Isle of Wight are very different. The Isle of Wight is commonly described as being 25 years behind everybody else. But in some reasons, in some ways, it's actually ahead of the rest of the population. And in one of those ways is the older population. So in actual fact, the percentage of people over the age of 65 on the Isle of Wight is much greater than the general population, which is why in some respects we're 25 years behind, but in a sense we're also a snapshot, or the Isle of Wight is a snapshot of what the population will look like in the future. Which also means, being that it's a very encapsulated population, it gives you the opportunity from a research perspective to look at a microcosm of what the rest of the UK could look like in a certain period of time. And so when I qualified as a mental health nurse, my first job was working with people with dementia. And as I was listening to the first presentation this morning, I'm thinking, is the diagnosis of the NHS got organisational dementia? But that's another question for another time. But while I was working there, one of the things I realised, one of the things that I became restless about, was actually I didn't belong in mental health care. And the reason I felt I didn't belong in mental health care is that I actually cared more for the person than I did for the numbers. And so that drove me to look at other areas of care. Now, tissue viability is a specialism in the sense of looking after wounds and looking after wound care. And in 2005, I applied for the job as a tissue viability nurse, and at that time it was just in the hospital. And in 2005 on the Isle of Wight, the hospital is a central part of the island, and most of the care is provided, certainly inpatient care was provided in that setting. And so I started with a job where I had to become enculturated with the data because it was very numbers driven, and I also had to enculturate myself with different groups of people. Because essentially, in delivering care for people with wounds, there's a wide cross-cultural element. Because if you're a ward nurse or a healthcare assistant, you'll be involved in wound care. If you're a doctor, if you're a ward manager, you'll be involved in healthcare and wound care as well. And in order to lead across a group of cultures where actually you've got to be able to provide the best possible care. And for me, I talked about pressure ulcers and I talked about leg ulcers in my retrospective projects. They all involve different cultures and different groups. And another group, which I'm really pleased came out in the first set of presentations as well, was the idea of the commercial sector and how the commercial sector were involved as well. Because in my experience and with what I did, a lot of the care pathways that I was involved in terms of wound care were driven by companies. So what bandages do I use? What mattresses do I use? Are all driven by companies that produce those products. Now, it's kind of an odd thing that I was reflecting on in the first set of presentations is we can't do without commercial companies. But what is the correct relationship to those commercial companies and how do you engage with them? What are the rules of engagement that involve you in being able to correctly work with them and also be able to direct their care in a positive way and direct their relationship with the NHS in a positive way. And so when I was working in that role, part of what I had to do was actually learn and listen and look around the cultures I was involving myself with. But one of the things that I reflected on, and I reflect on now, is that part of enculturation, or conventionally, the description of enculturation is you become part of the culture, you will be assimilated. I'm not good at that. I'm not actually good at being assimilated, sorry. And when you don't fit in, one of the elements that I've come to realise is actually you change the culture. Because one of the things, if you refuse to change, you're either going to give in and become part of the culture, or the culture changes because you're involved in it. And part of the role of appreciative inquiry, which is the reflective methodology that I've actually grounded my work in, is the idea that as you ask questions, you're changing what you're observing, and you're changing what's actually happening as well. As Clive has alluded to, the PhD by portfolio route means that you come with a body of work you've already done. My work that I've already done is largely quantitative. And the problem with largely quantitative work is there's a story there that you don't tell because it's all numbers. And so I think what I was very keen to do as part of the PhD thesis was actually tell that story and what that actually means. Because it's, when I used to go to meetings, I always used to present, I had this theory of what we call numbers, narratives, and next step. So you can present the numbers and what they mean and what they don't mean. But then it's always the story, what those numbers actually mean. So for me, if I was talking about pressure ulcers, I'd be talking about the numbers of pressure ulcers, but I'd also be reflecting on the fact that if they were going down, that's more people who are safer. You know, in our hands, when you came to the hospital, if I could show you that there was less pressure ulcers this year than there was last year, the story should have been that you should feel safer in our care because it's safer than it was last year. And so it's always this kind of ability to tell the story behind the numbers rather than just the numbers themselves, which I think I've reflected on now is one of those areas that we suffer with, that we can tell, we've got lots of data, but we don't tell the story about the data. Similarly, in the community settings, one of the issues that I navigated in the community setting was on the Isle of Wight, there was a large history behind it. You have GP surgeries. The GP surgeries used to be engaged with community nurses, but the community nurses changed. I ended up meeting my wife as part of going out to see the community as well. So, and one of the things I reflected on when I looked at the way Clive had actually put some of our presentation together is my wife actually grew up on the island. I moved to the island, and even though I've been there 38 years, I'm still not an islander. Now, how that works, you know, there we go. But it again speaks to the idea that you have to enter a culture. There has to be a degree of acceptance. And so for me, and part of my prospective work now, is the idea of actually talking about my experiences of leading through a series of changes in a culture where you've got to coordinate disparate groups. My prospective work is looking at skin health in skin cancer. So on the Isle of Wight, if you walk into a GP surgery and you've got an unusual lump, they can take a picture of that lump, it will go straight to the consultant, and within about 48 to 72 hours, you'll know whether you need to worry about it or not. That process didn't exist up until about 5 years ago, and I was part of that process because when you walk in the door and you're anxious about something, you want your anxiety to be relieved as quickly as possible, or you want to be told, yeah, it's a bit worrying, but you're in our hands and we can do something about it. You need to know that you've got somebody on your side that's going to do something about it for you. And the ability to compress that pathway in a way that actually helps you but also actually helps the professionals be in touch with you as quickly as possible is part of the process. But that leadership of that process, of actually instituting that, is actually really difficult, because GP surgeries are very much microcosms of the NHS as a whole, and they don't talk to each other, and they all do their own thing. And actually, what you then have to do is kind of rely on the idea that actually, if you start with the ones that are actually willing, everybody else will come along over time. And I think part of leadership, and part of what I've learned as part of my leadership journey, is actually you've got to go with the ones that are willing, and then everyone else comes along as you go along. And so for me, I'm looking forward to reflecting on what I've done in the past, and also bringing forward what I would like to think are the lessons that will come out in the prospective work as well.
Brilliant. I came up with the title of Getting Under the Skin of Skin, which is Glenn's PhD title. And as a clinical expert, the audience that he'll be talking to are not from an autoethnographic sort of background. So that's really interesting in itself. So, Danny Lee, doing his project on football. I'm just reflecting as I go along the actual immense amount of trust that these folks have put in me to supervise them, and I think maybe Danny's going to say something about that, I don't know, but I'll leave that to you. So Danny Lee, you have 10 minutes.
Just get that on there. No. Oh, thanks for coming, everyone. I'm going to share some stories with you. It's nothing to do with mental health, it's nothing to do with the healthcare profession, and it's completely off the wall probably to some of you. That's not me.
Okay. You're back.
So I want to put a little bit of context to where I come from and why I'm here today. My childhood was spent in the British film industry. My parents were technicians in film and TV. And I spent my childhood sort of travelling the world, all sorts of places, some really nice places and some different places, let's say. So constantly on the move, constantly sort of seeing new cultures, new dynamics. It was really interesting. And sometimes with language barriers, you're just sort of observing, you're just looking and you're just seeing what's going on. And in studios, you get to sort of know where to stand, not to get into the actors' eye lines, you know where to stand to sort of just be there but be out of the way, really quiet, observing. I went through the film industry until I was old enough to work in it. I worked in it for the first period of my life, which was up until about 30. I met my wife and we decided that one of us had to give it up if we were going to be sort of married for any longer than sort of 6 months, because it's quite rife for breaking up relationships. So we measured bank accounts. We quickly decided that she was a lot more successful than me. I came out of the industry and the only other thing I knew how to do was football. So I pursued a career in football and education. I wanted to go back and educate myself a little bit. I progressed through a foundation degree, a BA degree, and then I went on to my master's where I met Clive. When I met Clive, I just told him everything about me, what I was all about, and how I got to that stage of being in that room with him on that day. I wanted to do something that reflected who I was and my experiences and my relationships and significant people that I'd been in and around. And Clive said, right, okay, how open are you to practice research methods? And I went, yeah, look, let's go for it. So we went on a 2 or 3 day, well, I think a week adventure. I was doing lots of things that were really out of my comfort zone. I was camping out. I was sort of eating from dirty plates and stuff like that. A long way removed from where I was used to. But collecting data for me was quite easy, because as a social observer, it was quite easy for me to collect data because, being away from home so often, I was leaving the school environment and my social circle had moved on. So again, I was a social observer looking at the dynamics, and that was easy, but reporting the data was the tough bit. So we went through a series of about 8 different methods of reporting that data. And that's where I sort of fell in love with ethnography, or like talking about my version of the world. I moved on to the PhD, and again, really enthusiastic about football, and I had this great environment with all these different cultures coming in, working towards a common goal. And the more I progressed through it and told everyone, yeah, I'm doing a PhD, it's all about football, slowly realised that it wasn't about football at all. There was nothing, there was no relevance, that was just the reason everyone was together. I was just observing the dynamics, I was observing the people. I don't know, can we get the slide up?
Yeah.
Next one. Yeah. Next one. Yeah. So it was more about people, relationships and purposes. And this section here is my research wall. So I had to, during COVID, I had an opportunity. I was just about to go into my field work and COVID struck, and it was like, this could really damage my research here. So what we decided to do, I decided to do a lot of interviews because everyone's locked down, right? So I decided to do all these interviews, 8 different interviews with professionals all around the world. It was like Teams was genius for me. So I collected more data to inform me going into the field. And once I got myself into the field, it was like I was like an excited puppy, but I was really cautious because it was like the world of football, because I've been on this academic journey, had changed so much. Like it changed so much. Would they accept me? Would I accept them? So it was all about that social acceptance at first. So I went into the environment as an assistant manager, and that was my sort of guise to get in the door. I was very open. I was very overt about my intentions to collect the data. Some were a little bit sceptical. Some I knew already from in and around the football environment. But it wasn't long before they accepted me as an assistant manager. So I had 2 sections to my research book where I was taking notes on one side, and when the manager called me over, I'd quickly flip to the back, and it'd have all this sort of patterns of play and stuff like that on the back. So getting to the point of how my research come together, it was more to do with me and my lens, looking at what I was looking at and how I interpreted that. Storytelling, being the oldest medium of communication, seemed only natural. I mean, reflecting back, I spent a lot of time sitting in airports, watching people, looking at, you know, where they're going, running through the airport with their bags, some sitting there casually waiting for their flights, and sort of making up stories as I went along. So when I was able to write my accounts of what I see in a story form, it was perfect. It was perfect for me. Moving into the second section, which is the Vipers. This was one episode in the field that I'd introduced a player to come into this new group. So it was a new group to me, and it's a collective group of people that had been together for quite a while. So I introduced a new character to this sort of cast of people. And it really didn't go down so well, right? And I had a vested interest in the character because it was somebody that I'd educated from 16 and who was now 26. So having a vested interest, I was really watching how he was received in this environment. And there was 2 or 3 players that really didn't welcome him at all. So he could have done anything and it wouldn't have been good enough. So I watched one night, I wrote this account. We turned up for an in-house training game under the lights, and this guy politely went round, most polite man, gentleman, shook everybody's hand and greeted everybody, to these guys sort of politely shaking his hand, but you could see there was an intent there. We had the in-house game, and at one moment in the game, he was attacked physically, but not by 1, by 3 at different angles, and it was almost like Vipers taking a swipe at him. And I did a storied account on that, and I think, Clive, it was a good interpretation of what I'd seen. But on writing that, I was really angry. Like, I was so angry that this person had endured this experience. And I rewrote the story maybe about 7, 8, 9 times to try and, you know, make it so personal to me. And I said to Clive, I can't do this. Like, I'm portraying these people as out and out villains, and they're not. Like, outside of the dressing room, outside of the environment on the pitch, these are actually really nice people. People that I'd socially sort of sat down and had coffee with their family, and, you know, spoken to their children, and then thinking, I can't really give that interpretation of what it is. So on revisiting the story, I thought, but that's the data, right? So I have to report what I've seen, which I did so. But like, having reflected on it, like after a couple of years, I mean, I'm writing this story, it's like 2 years later, looking at that and thinking, like, what we see at the time is exactly what we see, but having the opportunity to revisit that and go over it again, I think on that reflexive part at the end was probably the most powerful part of the account.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you, Danny. What Danny doesn't say, he got so immersed in his work, he was lost in the field for over a year. Right, to stick a big crowbar down the back of his pants and yank him out of the field, and that's what
Which is also true.
Reflect, because otherwise he stood be there now, wandering around with the winders. He's able to write his stories because we put that was a traumatic exercise. So, anyway, right. Thank you for that, Danny. So Craig, the football analyst and lecturer, got immersed in his study and had a change of supervision, because I wasn't originally supervising. He had an absolute football man who was his supervisor. And because you were football crazy, weren't you? Well,
yes,
you still are.
football mad.
Until we started the but it's not, is well, we understand that Craig is a singer. And where does a singer's talent fit into football, but not on the, you know, on the terraces? Where does your talent lie as a thinker? If you're a songwriter, you're doing all this football analysis stuff. You live in a lie, why aren't you using your talents? So that's me and my little underground pulling a few strings, of course, small ropes. Until we discover what your true talents are. And then so, well, you could do it like this if I was your supervisor. Well, it wasn't coaching because the other thing was it was at risk of being homeless. So Craig turns to a much more phenomenological piece. So what Craig would talk about is actually a year's work with refining this song and revisiting the song. It's not just the song has emerged, it's all informed from his data and his observations. So, over to you, Craig.
Thank you, Clive.
I'll sit over it, because
okay.
you've got...
Yeah.
Yeah.
So obviously my time's cut in half, because half's going to be singing, so I'll try and get through this bit.
Well, we've got 15 minutes.
Okay, sorry, yeah. Yeah, right. Yeah, so great to meet you all today. So I'm Craig Lawlor. So I just want to sort of, I suppose, give an overview of what football scouting is in this context, because I appreciate when I've talked about this before, people go, oh, I get scouts and know what it's about, whereas I'm going to make the assumption that I'm going to lay some groundwork with what it's about and the area that I'm interested in. So there's been no real work done on adult professional scouting. It's been mainly like, oh, what age do you know that someone's going to be a professional? Now, I'm not really interested in that. And actually, I've been immersed in this world for sort of 7 years. I was in it as a professional football scout working with adults. And actually, I sort of set out on this whole path of like, well, I've seen it done well, and I've seen it done not very well, and I want to identify effective and ineffective practice in terms of like, who's good at spotting the good players and how do they do it, right? And that's essentially it. And the starting point really for scouts has always been going to the game with the notebook, making some notes and reporting back to someone who's more powerful than them. But actually there's been this proliferation of data and video and all these things that we can quickly and effectively cover all these games all around the world. And I was going, well, I'm going to show who's good at it and who's not good, and then I'm going to write a book and tell everyone this is how you do it. And what was really interesting was, the more that I spoke to people, the more that I considered my experience, because I had this overlap of being a scout and then leaving the industry, but actually observing in a different way what people did in their sort of day-to-day as a scout and seeing how they behaved. And actually, whenever I tried to get into it, of like, well, you know, why do you do it that way? And like, why do you think that's effective? They couldn't really tell me. It was always like, oh, you just know because the player is big, he's strong, he's quick. Yeah, but how do you know they're going to fit into you? How do you know you should spend £80 million on this player? You just know it's a gut feeling. So, but actually what they started to sort of share was like their experiences of how they navigated this world that actually is really toxic, it's really volatile, lots of conflict. Scouts are really undervalued. I mean, as I'll sort of share with you in a minute, like 40p a mile and a sausage roll is sometimes what people are paid to identify these players that are going to be worth hundreds of millions of pounds in the future. But then passing that information on to this superior, more powerful, more valued other, but really challenging for the scout. And I've kind of put these things as a little bit of a joke there, but also of sort of to say who I am and what I'm about, really. But actually, the work with Clive has led me down, as he said, sort of the phenomenological route. Not really appreciating that I was doing autoethnography for a long time, because I was sort of reflecting on my own experiences and going, actually, like, I went through some quite intensive CBT after being a scout, because I've been in this world for such a long time that was so demanding, so cutthroat, and something that I struggled to survive in. And actually, like, it's talking about men's professional football, and actually all the people I interviewed were white men, because that's the industry. And I'm thinking, well, if I struggled to survive in that industry, what about people who don't look and sound like me? So actually valuing scouts and what they do, but actually trying to make it more diverse and like I said, because that's where it's people working together, sharing their recommendations and their thoughts to try and make good decisions. Like, we want diversity in that, right? We don't just want the same people who see the world the same way. But yeah, so some of the things as well led me to existentialism and actually, like, not actually being these things. Like, I'm playing at being a PhD candidate, because one day I'm going to have it and I'm not going to be a candidate anymore. And I was a scout, and I really immersed myself in that industry. But I'm not anymore, and there's obviously a time that these things come to an end. But actually seeing that scouts find so much meaning in football and what they do, that they actually become a scout and they forget that they have a family and friends and another identity, really. So go to the next slide. And just to sort of share some of those themes, really, and actually having this observation, this ethnography of being in the field and seeing some things about, well, first, like, scouts finding meaning and going, well, football was my earliest love, you know, and I really wanted to pursue a career in it and be a player, but I couldn't. That tends to be quite a common thing of going, but I want to give other people the opportunity to do that. So that's one thing, positive and negative early experiences, really. But being undervalued, underpaid, often never meeting their line manager. So actually, when I sat down and asked questions like, so how many times do you watch a player before you make a decision? How many people watch the player? And they go, oh, well, I don't get on with anyone I've never met my boss. I get on better with the scouts that I see from other clubs at games. Thinking, well, that's got implications for the industry of, like, the bias and the influence. But actually, they were sharing really personal things and going, it's actually a really lonely job. It's a lonely place to be. This whole concept of ambiguity came through a lot, which led me down the sort of existential route with Simone de Beauvoir and her work, really, was actually that scouts don't have a job description. It's people employed through nepotism, nepotistic practices, and actually it's just a concept of going and watching lots of games and finding good players. So actually going, well, I've got anxiety all the time because I don't know who I am and what I'm meant to do, but I love it. And that's what came through of, like, this entering the industry and getting a coat with a badge on of a professional club that means a lot, and getting a sausage roll and on the way home and 40p a mile, and going, actually, I really don't like this industry, but at least I get this stuff and I love it for that reason. I get to watch football all day, every day. And that's enough for some people. But what I tend to find is that people slip into sort of at the end going, actually, like, I've spoken to one guy who, he did it for 27 years and woke up one day and said, I've wasted my life doing this. Like, and I've only just realised that now I want to go and actually be someone else and do something else rather than, you know, be in the industry. But otherwise, people slip into this bad faith where they behave like a scout is expected to. And it's like, oh, I've been to 5 games this week, I've watched 10 video games, because that's what you have to do. You know, and I haven't got a life outside of this. So it's telling that story, really. But actually, some people going, well, I really do get a buzz out of this, and that's why I do it. It's really fulfilling, it gives my life meaning, and that's fine. But and I don't think these people have been very good at reflecting on these things in the past. So actually being able to share their experiences, help them become more valued, and help them to understand why they do what they do, and hopefully enhance the industry, really. Yeah, okay.
And then we'll have 5 minutes for questions. So we have this dilemma of the scouts discovering.
Could we have the lyrics up, please?
Is it the next slide? What did you
Yes.
send?
With this potential, but it has to go. And how do I get credit for that? And what does that mean for them and their identity? And this has led to these kind of ideas.
So I think just really, really quickly, just to say, I mean, the bits that I've put in bold, you can join in if you want to. I'm not going to force anyone to, but the idea is kind of making this, and I've done a recording, which is obviously there for you. I'd make it sound like a football crowd, because that's what, although they're professionals in the industry, they're still watching it as supporters, as, you know, for their love of the game. But some key things of like a butter pie, Accrington, Blackburn Rovers, all things that, I mean, I'm not from the Northwest myself, but all things that are, you know, sort of in there. All the people I spoke to were for Northwest clubs, and obviously the cultural elements around that. Okay, so this is 40p a mile and a sausage roll, a song for the nowhere men of football scouting. 40p a mile and a sausage roll, my data reveals my professional role. Questions and motives and identity, the real outcomes of my scoutology. We're just a bunch of nowhere men finding players here and there. When we see a talent, we stop and stare. When they do something unique, it really makes us smile, as long as we get our 40p a mile. But it's not a science, we're not flying to the moon. But the manager, chief scout and I aren't singing the same tune. When I stop and think about it, I don't really know my role. But at least I get expenses and a sausage roll. I'm not sure what I'm doing here, we have no philosophy. Feels like I'm paralyzed by ambiguity. Did you hear about Bob? He got sacked by text, and now I'm wondering if I'll be next. I do it for the buzz while we've got someone. I watch players all day, but the job's never done. When football's good, it's great, it's unbelievable. But all our targets are unrealistic and unachievable. 40p a mile and a sausage roll, my data reveals my professional role. Questions and motives and identity, the real outcomes of my scoutology. I'm growing tired and weary of going to these games all alone. I've never met my boss, but he seems nice on the phone. I don't know who I'm watching, and what's worse, I don't know why. But at least the club will pay for my butter pie. There's a player here today, he's big, he's quick, he's strong. But my line manager and I don't get along. One day it might culminate in an ugly club-wide fight. 'Cause I'm sick of watching Accrington every Tuesday night. 40p a mile and a sausage roll, my data reveals my professional role. questions and motives and identity, the real outcomes of my scoutology. I want it to go on for as long as it can. I love it, but most days I feel like a hypocrite. Scouting is a privilege, the best job in the world. This is what it's like being in the scouting world. If you're not sure about being a scout, you should get out now. All those ex-players are holier than thou. I spent years in the industry, I don't want to stand here and gloat, but for my hard work I got a Blackburn Rovers coat. Thank you.
Thank you, Craig.
Thank you very much.
Me. So we had a hatch, match and dispatch. I was baptised, I had a wedding on a mud flat and then a funeral, and he planned all these and stage managed the whole lot, so I died for the sake of research methods. It was a sea burial at low tide, so I was okay. But we filmed it, and I've recommended Danny for one of the film recommendations here. But that's, canoeing was way out of his comfort zone, but he was able to write some really rich stories as a result. And it's out of all of them able to write rich stories as a result, where they found this commonality, I think. So there we go. We've got a couple of minutes for questions. Questions, problem, queries?
Not a question, but a comment to the last presentation. As teaching for more than 25 years at small university in Germany, encountering ambitious and promising students make me feel the same like the scoutology. And I can understand the whole process you had undergone, or what I could say there, but I found it very inspiring. All three presentations, but that is very close to my heart, being a teacher since Central now.
Yeah. Thank you. Well, there's this ongoing refining of thought all the time, and it's the freedom to do that. That I think I need to bring this over there. Yeah, sorry, I just remembered that.
Or repeat, either.
That's very good, thank you. Yeah, brilliant, thank you. So in particular for the two gents who are talking about the sort of football and entering into the football space, I'm really interested in the idea of sort of social class in relation to football. When you look at sort of rugby or cricket, you know, there's an overrepresentation of sort of privately educated, generally men going into those sort of fields. But with football, obviously, it's a predominantly sort of working class sport, at least at its roots. And I just wondered, in terms of your own backgrounds as autoethnographers, what role sort of social class played in your engagement with the field of football? And then once you sort of look at that hierarchy, I would imagine a completely uninformed but interested party that the sort of higher echelons of the footballing world are not sort of working class. So yeah, what am I asking? Sort of how does your own sort of social class background influence how you interacted with football as a space, I guess I'm asking.
Hold on, wait for the microphone.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, football is so accessible to the working class, and everywhere you go. I mean, I had people come over from Canada that didn't understand the vastness of the football pyramid, and driving from the airport, we must have seen about 200 games going on. They were just like, wow, because it's a working class sport in Canada. A middle class sport in Canada. And you're right. There was a quote. I was refereeing a match in a venue where there was a rugby team and there was a football team, two football teams, two rugby teams, and kind of lining up at the same entrance. And as I was walking out, I was looking at these rugby players, just enormous guys walking through. I got to the end, the referee went, "Good luck with these." he went, I'm going to have no problem with these are all gentlemen, and you know, it's a thugs game played by gentlemen as opposed to a gentleman's game played by thugs. And I went out to the group that I was working with, and he was right. I came in at the end of the game, I was exhausted. He was as happy as anything. But I think it's the access to it. And I think that, you know, even in like any comprehensive or any schools that are sort of on council estates, it's just football. There's no access to play tennis or rugby or anything like that. So they're going to go with what they know.
I think for me, my experience has been a little bit more geographically the area. So I think that I very much so, I'm conscious using this term, but in the Northwest we have what's affectionately called the Scouse Mafia that sort of runs football, and actually it's very much like, yeah, white working class males who employ people they grew up with who also went on that trajectory through sort of like youth football in Liverpool, into Liverpool Everton academies, and then into the, you know, rest of the Northwest really. So, and I found that very challenging really, because it's certainly like a microcosm of culture really, that humour and the language and the way that you might speak, you are kind of, I certainly felt excluded at times from that. And I also think it's that thing that they tend to be former players in the professional game who become coaches, scouts, etc. And they've got used to always, and I don't know what you think about this, but always competing for a spot in a team. So it's like, well, if that player gets injured next week, I'm in. So always compete. So then when they go into management positions, which often happens, they're not used to delegating and saying like, well, you're the expert, I'll let you get on with it. Still kind of that cutthroat nature really. Yeah, that they want to remain hands-on, which makes it challenging when you go, well, I'm just here as the specialist in this really, and I just want to contribute. It's almost like, well, no, but what do you want? Like, you want my job, don't you? No, I don't. I'm happy doing this. So, and I don't know if that's a class thing or not, or if it's just the culture of football. Potentially, I think, because a lot of these people have come from very little, and you know, maybe become, you know, earners of £60,000 a week as a player, and then on big money as a manager. Trying to go into that as not being a former player from that world is challenging. I certainly found that challenging. Yeah, I hope that answers the question.
Right. Thank you very much. We're on time. Well, sort of 2 minutes over. So we'll stop there. If there's a round of applause from my Getting Under Skin of Skin and 40p a mile and the Vipers.